Ahead and call the committee to order. It's going to be a little bit more confusing today because we have votes. We scheduled this hearing before they changed the schedule, and votes will be coming sometime in the next half hour. We'll take the votes and come back. We'll try to get through as much as we can. There is no particular hard stop, as I understand it, but we'd probably go till about 1 o'clock would be the plan. That's normally when things fade, but we'll see where people are at after that point. Also, I will not be here for the full hearing. Massive head cold, which is getting better. But Mr. Langevin will be in the chair for the last part of the meeting. But with that, I'm pleased to welcome the Secretary of the Navy, the Honorable Richard Spencer, Admiral John Richardson, Chief of Naval Operations, and General Robert Neller, Commandant of the Marine Corps. This seems to be a theme with our hearings these days, but as I understand it, Admiral Richardson and General Neller are soon to retire and may not have the pleasure of coming before our committee again. So I want to thank both of you for your outstanding service to the country and for your work with this committee. You've both done a great job of being very open, cooperating with us over here in Congress. I think we've worked very well together. I appreciate that relationship, and I appreciate your dedication and hard work. With that, I have an opening statement which I'll submit for the record and just make 3 quick points off of the top of it. First, I think the biggest challenge within the Department of the Navy right now is the new ships that you are building and preparing to build. And to put it bluntly, we have not had the best past record in terms of developing new large programs. We've had a number of them that never quite got off the ground, others that were truncated and wound up costing us a great deal of money. I think the number one most important thing that I want to hear from all of you today is how are we going to do better going forward? With the new frigate we're talking about doing, as I understand it's something of a replacement to the LCS, as we are developing new ships in a number of areas of capabilities. How can we be confident that this time we actually are going to get what we're looking for, not wind up wasting money, and wind up with a product? Because the history of that has been truly painful. Everything is expensive in this business, but it's really tough when you spend the money and you don't wind up with any product on the back end of that. Second is readiness and training issues. And I really want to thank Admiral Richardson in particular. You've been very open in discussing with us, your investigations into the accidents in the USS Fitzgerald and the McCain. We obviously need to do better. It's not just the Navy, it's throughout the force in terms of training, making sure that we keep the men and women who serve safe as we do this. So we'd love to get an update on readiness, where that is at, and how you see us being in a better position to avoid these types of accidents going forward. Lastly is an issue that I know will come up, and that is the issue of readiness as it relates to the deployment to the southern border and how it impacts the readiness of the force. I have no doubt that it is not a huge impact. It doesn't help. It is an additional distraction to the overall mission of the military. We're also concerned about the taking of money out of the Department of Defense to go towards the President's emergency on the southern border and building that wall. But the one message, and this message is not for the people here, it's just on the issue that I think is really important. There wasn't actually any crisis at the border when President Trump took office. We were doing better than we had done in about 15 years. 2+ years later, it's a mess. And you can debate, what the solution is. Is it a crisis? Is it an emergency? But you cannot debate that the situation on our southern border is vastly worse than it was 2 years ago. Personally, I don't think spending tens of billions of dollars on a wall is going to change that equation. The biggest thing driving it is people are desperate, primarily in Central America, and they're coming because of that desperation. So if we're going to solve this, let's start thinking about how we can stop them from being so desperate and coming to our border. And most of the crisis right now is asylum seekers. It's not people trying to sneak into the country. It's people showing up and making themselves available for asylum. And I don't know exactly what policies have led to this, but there are a couple that don't help. One, we have dramatically reduced the number of people being allowed in as refugees. We are making asylum tougher and tougher to seek, so people out there are desperate. They don't see a process. Those who are trying to get out of horrific situations, particularly in Central America. Latter, with a daily threat of closing the border, folks feel like this is it. If they don't come now, they're never going to have a chance. Sorry, not lastly, one other thing. Cutting off aid to the Central American countries that are struggling, that are beset with violence and poverty and a lack of economic opportunity, only makes it more likely that more people are going to come. We can build all the walls and send all the troops and set up all the sensors and do everything we've got as long as we create a situation where more and more people are going to try to come into our country. We're never going to be able to deal with it. We need to get at the source of the problem so we can take the pressure off of the Pentagon, off of you gentlemen, so that we're not, DHS isn't always showing up and asking you to do things that they ought to be able to handle themselves. We've got enough to do with the Department of Defense to get the readiness up to where we want it, to meet the national security threats in the complex threat environment. We don't need to create a bigger problem on the southern border that distracts from those already difficult and incredibly important missions that you all at the Department of Defense are trying to implement. With that, I will turn it over to Mr. Thornberry for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me join in welcoming our witnesses, and may I begin, General Neller, by expressing condolences to the Marine Corps and to the family and friends and colleagues of the 3 Marines who lost their lives yesterday in Afghanistan. I think it's important for their family and others to know that they were there to protect our country. That was their mission, and we grieve their loss and honor their service. I also want to thank Admiral Richardson and General Neller for your service over many years. I'm not quite ready to let y'all go yet. So we still, as we work our way through a number of issues, I'm sure we'll have a lot of interactions with the committee, but I join the chairman in appreciating what y'all have done. If you step back and look, from when each of you first assumed your current position. In some ways, things are on a better track. We have a national defense strategy. We have this year a budget that is, you can debate to what degree, but at least somewhat tied to that national defense strategy. And is looking ahead at the challenges that we face before us. My sense, and this is what I'm going to ask you in a minute, is that we've turned the corner maybe on readiness. I noticed there was a study that was published yesterday that said for aviation, the Navy was slightly worse last year than the previous year. The Marine Corps was slightly better, but if you look at overall accident rates, it is somewhat better than it was, even though it's still way too high. I join the chairman, Admiral, in appreciating the efforts y'all have made on the surface combatant accidents and training and so forth that y'all have tried to improve. And I'll say another way things are getting better is I was heartened by the reports yesterday that finally there are some serious discussions going on about a cap deal. Because as all 3 of you have talked about before with this committee, it's the amount of funding and the consistency of funding that enable y'all to make the most use of the dollars that the taxpayers provide. So there'll be a lot of questions today, a lot of issues. I'm going to avoid the border debate for the moment. But I guess the last thing I would say is even though we, in my estimation, are on a better track, the enemy always gets a vote, and they're not going to wait for us to get our act together. So there is still a sense of urgency dealing with the shipbuilding issues that the chairman talked about and other things. I'm sure we'll touch on most of those today. Again, thank all of you for being here. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Spencer.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of this committee, on behalf of our sailors, our Marines, and our civilian teammates, we want to iterate yet again, thank you for your bipartisan support of restoring funding stability. Before I begin, I would also like to reflect what the ranking member just said, and we all keep the 3 Marines that were lost in our prayers and our thoughts, and also one of our allies. The Japanese lost somebody who is still being searched for, and we should keep our allies in our thoughts and prayers. I'd be remiss not to say, wearing a businessman's hat, that I could not have asked for 2 better business partners in the last 20 months of working here as Secretary of the Navy. The CNO and the Commandant have been terrific. If I was to put my business hat on and use business terms, ladies and gentlemen, the Navy that I sat down to was literally a corporate turnaround. We've made Herculean efforts, and you'll hear about them today. But these two gentlemen, there was no light between us as we walked down the path and moved some big rocks out of the way, and I'd like to tip my hat because this is their last time probably in front of you, but more importantly to me, I'm going to lose two great people this summer. I'm going to gain two great ones, but for this moment, I'd like to say thank you in public. The concept of a strategy is the application of limited resources to attain a goal. Aligned to the National Defense Strategy, the Navy's strategy for restoring readiness, strengthening relationships, and reforming our processes has been set. And we build on that with a disciplined focus on people, capabilities, and processes. This budget prioritizes a strategy-driven, balanced approach to investment. It builds on prior investments that we have made, sustains the industrial base, and maintains our competitive advantage, if not expands it in certain areas, as we transition to a more cost-imposing, survivable, and affordable future force. The restoration of readiness is well underway, and we're seeing progress each and every day. My analogy is that the wind vanes are all pointed in the correct directions, and although we might be frustrated with the velocity, we continue to increase it day by day. We're building the strength of our team through hiring in areas of critical need, such as cybersecurity specialists, aviation technicians, scientists and engineers, human resource specialists, shipyard workers, and digital warfare officers. We're aligning and enhancing our educational institutions and our distributed learning venues through the Education for Sea Power Review. And we're taking aggressive actions to return private military housing to a premium product, mindful that while we recruit the individual, we retain the family. All of these actions have one common thread: the goal of increased readiness. We're building our capabilities through investments in hypersonics, machine learning, additive manufacturing, quantum computing, and directed energy. We're building the fleet in pursuit of a 355-ship Navy, manned and unmanned, to include the Columbia-class submarine, next-generation frigate, remotely piloted sea platforms such as Sea Hunter and Orca. These efforts are increasing lethality through our increased distributed maritime operations. To reach the Secretary's goal of 80% mission-capable tactical aircraft, we've realigned investments into spare parts, aviation engineering, logistical support through our newly created Navy sustainment system, incorporating best practices from outside the wire, or, as we might say, from commercial airline maintenance leaders. As a pilot program, these activities have moved us to review our processes in all maintenance areas within the naval enterprise, to include ship, weapon, vehicle maintenance, and sustainment. Driven by the Marine Corps Force 2025 capability investment strategy, we're investing in the amphibious combat vehicle, loitering munitions, and unmanned logistical systems in order to maintain and, as I said earlier, expand our competitive advantage on the margins. Exercising the Marine Corps operating concept is moving us to rapidly progress as a continual learning organization as we adapt and experiment in our new competitive environment. Yet while we effect the aforementioned, the Marine Corps is also contending with the unprecedented double impact of Hurricanes Florence and Matthew, which together damaged or destroyed more than $3.7 billion of infrastructure across many of our East Coast installations. Camp Lejeune, as many of you know, is our primary force generator for naval services, directly contributing to the capacity and readiness of our force. That area took the majority of the blunt impact of the storm. Over the past year, we have meaningfully increased our interaction with our allies and friends. Exercising and education have strengthened the ability to operate and therefore increased the depth of our collected ability to deliver the forces required. Compared to a year ago, the increase in this depth of our relationship with our allies and friends has been the prime contributor to the good of this outcome. Our Navy has implemented 91 of the 111 Readiness Reform and Oversight Council recommendations, transforming a culture of accepting risk to one of understanding and managing risk. We've reviewed and are in the process of reviewing the remediation of our business processes following our first ever top-to-bottom audit. The great news on the audit is, ladies and gentlemen, it's now proving to be a tool where we can leverage lethality. We're using this information to streamline operations and to reimagine how support functions can be modernized to drive continual learning, therefore producing ever-increasing efficiencies for the American taxpayer. We owe it to them to ensure every dollar we invest, every dollar, is invested in the most effective manner possible. I'm proud to work with this committee to keep that promise. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Admiral Richardson.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, and distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity to appear alongside Secretary Spencer and General Neller to discuss the Navy's fiscal 2020 budget. President Jefferson wrote, "Industry, commerce, and security are the surest roads to the happiness and prosperity of our people." And the causal link between prosperity, order, and security is why he deployed the United States Navy to combat piracy off the Barbary Coast at the dawn of the 19th century. And it's why, for over 2 centuries, we have helped keep the seas open for all and oppose those who seek to control the seas at the expense of America and her allies. Today, as outlined in the 2018 National Defense Strategy, nations like China and Russia are attempting to do just that, to stem the tide that has steadily lifted all boats by unilaterally redefining international norms on terms more favorable only to themselves. The nation and the Navy are responding, with more than 60,000 sailors deployed aboard nearly 100 ships and submarines at this very moment, by sustainably operating around the globe, advocating for our principles, and protecting our national interests. To maintain this worldwide posture, the President's budget offers a strategy-driven, future-leaning, balanced approach to deliver a naval force up to the task in this era of great power competition. The single most effective way to maintain our strategic momentum is to provide adequate, stable, and predictable funding. This makes everything possible. It solidifies strategic planning, incentivizes our commercial partners, and mitigates operational risk by maximizing our planning and execution time. The foundation of naval power is our force of talented and well-trained sailors. And important to our success, we remain committed to recruiting and retaining diverse shipmates whose intelligence, curiosity, energy, different backgrounds, and varied viewpoints will catalyze the speed and quality of decisions we need to outperform our adversaries. As well, working with Congress, we continue to transform our pay and personnel systems to 21st century standards. This budget builds a bigger fleet, 55 battle force ships over 5 years, preserving our industrial base and strengthening our ability to prevail in any warfighting contingency. This budget fully funds the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine program, fulfilling our existential imperative to deter a nuclear attack on our homeland. This budget builds a better fleet, fielding state-of-the-art systems that are more agile, networked, resilient, and lethal. This budget recognizes that aircraft carriers will be central to winning the future fight, which is why it invests in the Gerald R. Ford class, delivering far more combat power for less cost over their lifetimes than their Nimitz-class predecessors. And this budget builds a ready fleet, steaming days to exercise at sea, flying hours to train in the air, sufficient quantities of ammunition and spares, the resources to conduct maintenance today and in the future as the fleet size grows. Meeting the nation's and the Navy's responsibilities is not easy. It requires us all to work together, but this is what great nations and only great nations can and must do. At the dawn of the Cold War, as the nation took on the challenge to go to the moon, President John F. Kennedy, a naval officer, said, "We do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one that we are unwilling to postpone, and one that we intend to win." I'm grateful to this committee and your colleagues in the Congress for continuing this important work. We look forward to sailing alongside you to build and deliver the safest Navy for our sailors, the strongest partner Navy for our friends and allies, and a Navy that's the worst nightmare for our enemies. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral. General Neller.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the committee, I'm here today to testify on the posture of your Marine Corps. I appreciate this opportunity to be here and look forward to your questions. I know this committee, the Congress, and the American people have high expectations for our Marines. As our nation's expeditionary force and readiness, you expect your Marines to be ready to operate forward with our Navy in the contact and blunt layers of the global operating model, and to assure our partners, deter our rivals, and respond to crises across the range of military operations. And if that deterrence should fail and we are called to fight, you expect us to fight and win. As we hold this hearing, approximately 41,000 Marines, along with our Navy shipmates, are forward deployed or postured in more than 60 countries around the world, some in harm's way, as we were reminded of 2 days ago. All engaged, doing exactly what you would expect of them. Throughout our history, you've called upon your Marines to respond immediately to crisis around the globe, either from the sea, from forward bases, or from home station. To meet your intent to be ready to suppress or contain international disturbances short of large-scale war, we strive to prevent war by assuring our allies and deterring our rivals with ready, capable, and persistently present expeditionary forces. Forward-postured naval forces, your Navy Marine Corps team, remain critical to that end, providing the nation a significant operational advantage through maneuver access and our presence. Supporting day-to-day operations through theater security cooperation, building partner capacity, providing when required humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, or supporting current global contingencies requires your expeditionary force and readiness to be present. We recognize the strategic environment is constantly changing, requiring adaptations to our organization, our training, our equipment, and our warfighting concepts in order to provide our nation the most lethal naval expeditionary force it demands. Your Marine Corps remains committed to building the most ready, capable, and adaptable force the nation can afford. This requires hard choices as we balance our commitments to current operations, work to continue to improve our readiness, and pursue modernization efforts designed to increase our competitive advantages over our adversaries. Thanks to your efforts in Congress to provide increased and on-time funding, you have made some of these choices far less difficult. Still, we remain challenged by the lasting effects of Hurricanes Florence and Michael that hit the East Coast last fall. The financial cost of these storms totals $3.7 billion, but the impacts go much deeper. I look forward to answering any of your questions on this issue. I do want to thank the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Congress, and the administration for their work in support and approving a $400 million of reprogrammed resources so we can begin immediately to address some of those needs at Camp Lejeune and the North Carolina area. The Marine Corps continues to work tirelessly to address our remaining shortfall for this year, but we are prepared to make the decisions necessary in the short term so that we continue to train and be ready, repair our facilities, and continue to increase our readiness. Despite these challenges, the Marine Corps remains on the right path as we implement the National Defense Strategy. We continue to develop effective warfighting concepts and invest in the right capabilities while experimenting ruthlessly to validate these choices. Most importantly, to the success of your Corps, we continue to be able to recruit and train the most qualified men and women our nation has to offer, men and women who raise their right hand, desire to earn the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor, and ask to serve something greater than themselves and represent the best our nation has every day around the world. The Navy Marine Corps team remains our nation's naval expeditionary force in readiness, forward deployed, postured, and competing every day. And with the Congress's continued support and commitment, we'll ensure that if we must send our sons and daughters into harm's way, they will have every advantage our nation can afford and provide. As was mentioned, this is likely my last opportunity to appear before this full committee as I close out 44 years as a Marine and the last 4 as a Commandant, and I want to personally thank this committee and the Congress for the support you show every day to your Marines. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. And as we missed in my opening statement, the 2 most important things we can do is get the CAPS deal that the ranking member referred to so that we can get that budget on time by October 1st. I know it made a huge difference to actually have that last year for the first time, and Lord knows how long. And the second is passing some sort of supplemental emergency funding bill. I know that's really impacted the military, and we're going home in a couple hours, and we're not going to get it done before the April recess, and that's a huge problem, well, for the country, but also for the Department of Defense. These are 2 things that we in Congress need to get done to help you. Just one area of questioning, Mr. Secretary, is my opening comments about as you're developing new platforms, moving forward with the Columbia-class submarine, having a replacement for the large surface combatant ships. What have you learned? I know we've talked a lot about your efforts to try to figure out how to be more cost-effective in acquisition and procurement to bring some of your business skills, and I've been very impressed with what you guys have done in terms of making it more efficient and more effective. But this is the big stuff. This is the billions of dollars. What did we learn from the mistakes of the past, from the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, from the DDG 1000, where we wound up with only 3 ships, from the U-class? What have you learned from that that's going to be different as you move into these large new procurements that are going forward so that we can actually get a product in a cost-effective way?
Chairman, day one arriving, the whole approach that I'd had with industry is that we truly do have to become partners, and that's not just words. My definition of partners is shared risk, shared return, and benefits. Aligning ourselves with people who can solve our problems and have skin in the game is the best fundamental formula that we can have. We've moved closer and closer towards that as we go forward. We've increased the actual understanding.
If I may, and I'm
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but that's all kind of generic speak. What I would love is, what's a concrete example? Gosh, here's what we did wrong, here's why I want, and here's how we're going to do it different this time. Just 1 or 2 concrete examples.
Fine. Concrete examples. Using technology that's available to us off the shelf in designing ships and building ships. We now have digital tools versus paper. Huge savings in that regard. The concept of modular building, increasing modular building. Do we force that upon the contractor themselves? No. Do we help them and steer them? Do we work together? Yes, we do. Again, cost savings in that regard. Requirements, focusing requirements and understanding that the contractor is in the game. And the reason I led with that, Chairman, is we have to know what is the best solution that they have. To walk into the marketplace and say, I want this, this, and this, and this, without the supplier going, wow, if you took this path, I can save you 15%. That is the two-way communication that's really helped us going forward as far as partnership goes.
Yeah, that's exactly what I want to hear, and that makes sense, and that's incredibly important going forward to make sure that we follow through on that. We got votes coming up, so I'll cut this short and go to Mr. Thornberry.
Admiral and Commandant, I mentioned at the beginning, my sense is that we've turned a corner on readiness, but we are certainly not where we need to be. And I would appreciate each of you kind of stepping back and giving this perspective of where we've been, where we are, and where we're going on the broader readiness issues that we've talked about with this committee so much.
Thank you, sir. I'll take the first stab and then hand it off to the Commandant. First is that we funded those readiness accounts. And so since I've been CNO, we've been steadily funding those at pretty much the requirement or the maximum executable. And that's allowed us, particularly in the enabler accounts, as we call them, the parts, the engineering, and everything to support readiness, the flying hour program, the steaming hour program, maintenance programs, all of those have been funded. Then in response to the collisions in the 7th Fleet, as we briefed, we've got a comprehensive review and a program. The Secretary highlighted the number of measures that we've taken, but really what we've done is working on a change of culture there. So the first thing we did is reestablish schedule discipline out in the 7th Fleet. And we don't send a ship out to do a mission until they're maintained, trained, and certified to do that mission. And that return of that discipline has ensured that our ships are ready to go. With respect to the training required, both pipeline, career-based training, as pointed out in my written statement, the amount of sea time experience that an officer will get when they take command is almost double now with this near career path than it was before. As well, the schoolhouse training has increased at every level of an officer's career, and not only in amount but also quality, as we've brought in a lot of high-fidelity simulators to enhance that training and complement the at-sea training. And so really we've moved from a climate where we needed to make sure that we were safe to operate, then able to comply with all requirements, now really striving towards that culture of excellence, measuring ourselves the whole way to make sure that we are achieving the goals that we set out to achieve.
And just briefly, Admiral, how far do we have to go?
Well, this is really establishing a new normal, sir. And so I would say that in many ways we are at that new normal. Some of this is going to be career-long types of things. And so we need to, I would advocate for letting this program have some run time so that we can see some of the longer-term benefits before we start to make changes. That was one of the symptoms of the past, is that we kept moving the goalposts. And so I think we've got ourselves on a good course. Many of the near-term goals have already been met. Some of the longer-term goals are going to be career-type things. And then these simulators are going to be in place in the next couple of years. So I think we're on a good track, sir.
Chairman or Ranking Member Thornberry, you ask if we turn the corner. It's like being too ready is like having too much money or being too good looking. It's impossible to be too ready. So have we improved? Absolutely, and I can quantify that for you, particularly with aviation. More hours flown, more ready aircraft, the goal of 80% TAC air, which means we're, based on OSD standards, we have 10 squadrons. They're supposed to have 12 jets, which means we got to have 96 jets that can fly. We've been up into the 80s, so we're continuing to strive for that, and we may make it like for 1 or 2 days, but it'd be very difficult to sustain that level. But as the CNO said, we had not previously funded the readiness accounts. The training piece of this is even more different because at the same time we have current operations, we're trying to modernize those capabilities to be able to be effective for the current op, and we're trying to change the force fundamentally for what we anticipate the fight to be in the future. So a lot of the training changes that we've been able to do because of the resources allow us to fight more against a peer adversary as opposed to operate in what we've done in the last 17 years, 18 years, which is a counterinsurgency, stability, counterterrorism fight. And it's fundamentally different, having to consider mentally the training aspects to fight against an adversary who has an Air Force, who has long-range fires, who can jam your nets, who can take down the network. And so obviously those capabilities are things that we need to look at now, our ability to operate in cyber, in the information domain, to protect our network, which is our friendly center of gravity, the thing that we have to protect to be able to operate. So are we making progress? Absolutely. Turning the corner, we continue to make progress, and we're never going to be satisfied that we're too ready.
Sir, if I could just add on a little bit, the Congress has been working really hand in hand with us here. We talked, both the Commandant and I, about funding, and I would say since the 17 requests for additional appropriations, the 18 and 19 budgets, that's helped tremendously. We hope to keep that momentum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The only thing I'd say is, by turn a corner, I mean, it's not getting worse. It's getting better. That's the corner.
No, it's quantifiably better, and I can show you the metrics for that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I yield back.
There are always more corners, but it's good to have that one turn. I agree with the ranking member. We've made an enormous amount of progress. Votes have been called. We're going to get through one questioning and then go. So we'll start with Mr. Langerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome our witnesses here this morning. Thank you for your testimony, in particular, Admiral Richardson, General Neller. Thank you both for your service to the country. I know that you said this is the Secretary said this is the last appearance likely before the committee, and I want to just thank you for your service. You have all made a difference, both in improving our military and enhancing our national security. We are grateful. Secretary Spencer, if I could start with you, I understand that you recently commissioned a review of the of our cybersecurity readiness of the Navy and Marine Corps. And I think you commissioned that study, as cybersecurity clearly is one of the greatest challenges that I believe that we face as a nation, both now and going forward. Again, I commend you for taking the step and doing the study and commissioning it. However, I also understand that one of the primary findings of the report was that was the need to change the culture of the Navy in a way that must stem really from the senior most leadership. So I was a little disappointed that you didn't expand upon that more in your opening statement. But if going forward, if you can expand upon that right now, because the bottom line is, if you don't prioritize it, how can we expect your deputies to do so? So can you help the committee understand what you're doing in response to the review's recommendations?
Congressman, thank you. I could spend a day on this topic, and it is a high priority topic, if not one of the highest. And one of the things that came out of the study, and the reason we had the people on the study that were there, was to look outside the wire and see some of our compatriots in large organizations who have gone down the cyber path and the learning curve. J.P. Morgan, Caterpillar, large corporations. And in every single case, it starts at the top. You hit the nail on the head. It is a cultural issue, and it is a mechanical issue. It is a hygiene issue for data, and it has to be led at the top. We have right now, one of the members of the group who did the study is on board in Navy right now, prioritizing the findings that he helped write to put together our remedial plan to go forward on the cyber issues facing the Navy Marine Corps team.
Okay. I look forward to working with you on that.
Most
Clearly,
definitely.
Our enemy's adversary is not standing still in this, and they've used this asymmetric technology to undermine our advantages, and we want to make sure that we're as resilient and strong in that area as possible. Secretary, I wanted to say I'm concerned about the resiliency of Navy and Marine Corps bases to the effect of climate change and rising sea levels. Thank you for, obviously, you identified Camp Lejeune as having taken a major hit, billions of dollars of damage done as a result of a storm that they had to go through. And really underscores the need for the Navy and the Marine Corps to consider resilience in their installation master plans. So in this point, what investments are you making today in order to mitigate risks that we're going to face in the short, medium, and the long term to our CONUS and OCONUS institutions, and how are you evaluating those risks as they evolve? Otherwise, if we're not planning ahead, we're going we have to face the fact that climate change is here and is going to cost us more if we don't prepare for it and mitigate those effects going forward.
Congressman, spot on. Shared those exact same concerns. We have done an inventory around all our bases, and it's not just rising water. It's drought, it's fire, it's any weather-induced massive impact to our bases. And we have done our analysis. As an example, Norfolk. We have a MILCON project for, in most simplest terms, diking around Norfolk for rising waters. Camp Pendleton, we're constantly looking at how we can address fire control at Camp Pendleton. All our seaside bases, we are looking at what we can do going forward with all our projects to add into those projects rising water and or weather-related events.
Thank you. I want to continue to work with you on that as well.
Yes, sir.
Finally, as you know, China, it appears, has fielded a railgun. We're making advances in railgun technology. When are we going to be fielding our railgun?
Congressman, we have a whole priority of advanced weapons that we've talked about, directed energy. Railgun is in there. I'll defer to the CNO quickly on the actual technical application there. It is a priority. Put it this way, it has been prioritized within the Navy. We are focusing on some other areas that we think are probably more productive when it comes to a weapon. But, CNO, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Sir, we're continuing to work on the railgun.
The gentleman's time has expired. I don't want to rush you. Sorry, I should have said this up front. I try to keep people to the 5 minutes and not have to do that. But if you got something quick, Admiral, go ahead. Since
we're continuing. We're working on integration. We're going to take the railgun out to White Sands, and we've made some great progress, not only on the gun itself, which is a lot of energy in a short period of time, but also on the projectiles, the high-velocity projectile. There's as much a benefit from that program as anything else because they're adaptable to other guns as well. So there's money in the budget to advance this program this year.
Thank you, Admiral. I apologize. I should point out for the witnesses. We try to keep them to the 5 minutes as much as possible, and I don't want to cut you off in mid-word, but we'll try to move it on. We have 5 votes, I think. Doing the math, and it pains me to say this, it's probably going to be about 11:45 before we get back. We don't move too quickly over on the floor, regrettably. So we'll just plan on reconvening at 11:45. And I appreciate your patience. We are in recess. Thanks.
With that, I'll yield to Mr. Wilson for 5 minutes.
And thank you very much, Acting Chairman Courtney. And gentlemen, it's particularly an honor for me to be here with you. And thank you for your service in that I am here as a member of Congress, but also as the very grateful dad of a a naval doctor who works with the Marines General at Parris Island. And I'm also very grateful and wish you well in your retirement, General Neller. You've made such a difference on behalf of our country. And Secretary Spencer, the fiscal year 2020 budget request includes approximately $10 billion for cybersecurity. South Carolina is uniquely positioned to advance cybersecurity partnerships that enhance the U.S. capabilities to compete with adversaries in cyber domain. Our Adjutant General Van McCarty is advancing cybersecurity partnerships through existing force structure with senior military colleges like the Citadel and the proximity of key infrastructure. How does this request reflect the new cyber strategy? Does this request include any programs that work with universities or industry?
Thank you, Congressman. I had the pleasure of joining, I believe, Senator Scott down in Charleston about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he introduced me to the Military Contractors Association down there. And we also had a chance to tour the new training facilities that are online in Charleston for the nuclear training facilities. It does align, and the reason I'm pausing for a second is, as I told you earlier, the review that I just had done is now being created and implemented. Our implementation plan will be rolled out. You will see more coming along that way. But in the $10 billion, we are aligning ourselves not only through the Naval Postgraduate School, but through other organizations and institutions outside the wire.
And that's really encouraging. And also encouraging, each of you earlier in the hearing provided an update in regard to readiness and the progress that's being made toward readiness, and part of that is modernization. There are 3 versions of FA-18 Hornets that are found aboard the Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort, the FA-18A and C Hornet and the FA-18D Hornet. These are older models showing their age. What is the plan, Mr. Secretary, and timeline to replace these aging aircraft and add new Super Hornets to the inventory?
As far as the Marine Corps is concerned, no new Super Hornets in the Marine Corps. We are transitioning to all 5th generation, which, if I'm not mistaken, Commandant, we're somewhere around 2030 for the actual full transition to the F-35B and C.
That's excellent. And Admiral, I was grateful to have recently met with General Steve Lyons, and he testified to this committee the need for increased sea lift capacity. How is the Navy addressing the TRANSCOM Commander's #1 request for increased sea lift? What is your assessment of the current ready reserve fleet and the ability of it to support the national defense strategy?
Sir, as I'm sure General Lyons told you, we currently meet the requirements, but that fleet is aging out quickly, and so the need for recapitalization there is urgent. We're working very closely with TRANSCOM and also Admiral Busby. We are taking sort of a 3-pronged approach. One is to do life extensions where those life extensions make fiscal sense. The second approach is to buy used ships that will meet the requirements, and we're taking advantage of all the authorities that Congress has given us with respect to buying used. And then the third is to build new. And so it's the combination of those 3. Right now, though, I think we're also I'm interested in having a discussion in terms of how we can best incentivize domestic shipbuilding in the United States of America. And I think that all of this would help not only the sea lift part of TRANSCOM's issues, but also alleviate some of the costs for DoD shipbuilding, Navy shipbuilding. And so I think that that would be a good thing to discuss as part of this as well.
And additionally, Admiral, I appreciate how the budget invests in continuing to rebuild aviation readiness. What lessons have the Navy and Marine Corps learned from pursuing former Secretary Mattis's goal of 80% mission capability for the strike fighter aircraft?
Yes, sir. I think the Secretary has described it that we are really going outside to take a look at what are the commercial best practices. And we've brought a lot of those ideas in-house. And so in terms of workflow, establishing that workflow and maintaining it, that's allowed us to have a steady ramp towards achieving that 80% readiness, and we're optimistic that that's going to happen. And then the stable funding has allowed us to refill parts bins and parts baskets that were previously empty. And so that's also reducing the time in maintenance.
Again,
Congressman, I
thank you
got to
for your
beep just for a
service.
second
Yes.
because readiness right now, Navy Marine Corps team, F-18s, 67 to 70%, which when I was here a year ago, we were nowhere near that.
Progress.
Gentleman's time has expired. Again, going in order, I'm going to yield myself 5 minutes. And first of all, I just want to start by saying, as someone who's been on the Sea Power Committee for the last 4 or 5 years, I want to thank all the witnesses for their great work. In particular, Admiral Richardson and General Neller, as you start to head towards the exit. Again, both of you served straddling 2 administrations, 2 national security reviews, and have really, I think, done an outstanding job in terms of just integrity and excellence. And again, I want to thank you publicly. I'd like to focus for a second on the inclusion of funding to build a 3rd Virginia-class submarine in the 2020 budget to be actually executed in the 2023 timeframe. From a strategic standpoint, this is a step to more rapidly reach 66 attack submarines called for in the 2016 Force Structure Assessment. Today, of course, the fleet stands at 51 and will drop to 42 by 2006. Admiral Richardson, can you state what the impact of even 1 additional attack submarine would have on the Navy's operational capability? Can you discuss what types of O-plans it would help support in an unclassified setting?
Sir, I'll do my best. One is that with respect to our greatest gap between the warfighting requirement and current inventory, there's no greater need than the attack submarine fleet, as you highlighted just with the numbers. It's a wide gap and it's getting wider. So every single submarine counts against closing that gap. Why do we need that force level? Well, in the O-plans, I think it's safe to say in this forum that particularly the more stressing O-plans in the Pacific and in the Atlantic, the first failings, the first response among them are going to be the submarine response. And they're going to go out there early. They're going to use their stealth and speed to get into far forward areas and really establish the conditions for the rest of the joint force to execute their part of the campaign. And so right now we're stressed to meet those requirements just because of the force level in particular, combined with maintenance. And so every single submarine counts. If you think about a submarine going out there with 26 tubes in its torpedo room and missiles on board as well, and coming back empty, it's a tremendous influence on the battle space there, and that asymmetric aspect of it to open the door for the rest of the joint force.
Thank you. And again, just to follow up, there's been some discussion, the fact that we're funding this sub outside the block contract program, which is 2 subs a year. There's been some questions raised about whether or not it's adding risk in terms of the Columbia program, which obviously is happening pretty much in that same time frame. I was wondering if you could just, sort of explain whether or not doing it this way actually, with flexibility, will in fact maybe help de-risk the Columbia program.
So that's exactly how I see it, and I was up at Electric Boat just last week to have them walk me through that from their perspective. First, I've got to say, what a great situation where a lot of this involves workforce, bringing workforce on, and all of our shipbuilders, but it was very vivid there at Electric Boat, are bringing in so many young people. About 50% of the workforce has less than 5 years of experience now, which is just such a terrific story in terms of building those skills to do welding, pipe fitting, electricians, et cetera. So that's part of it. They showed me their workload curves and how they're actually going to use this to mitigate peaks and valleys, smooth out their level of effort. If we get the flexibility to do this, as you said, we'll fund it in 20 because the SCN profile is much smoother then, and then we'll execute it as a 23 ship because that smooths out the workforce. So the combination of that really is almost a stabilizer rather than an increased risk.
Thank you, appreciate that. And then one quick question. Again, one of the initiatives is the unmanned vessels that are part of the budget here. And again, I think there's enthusiastic recognition that this is where the future is going to be headed. But in terms of just investing upfront this year, I just wonder if the two of you could comment a little bit in terms of whether or not we're getting a little ahead of our skis in terms of creating a program where the mission set isn't quite developed yet, and hopefully we won't repeat some of the mistakes of the past.
Let me go first on that if I could, and then hand it over to the CNO. Congressman, it's a great observation, but one of the things that you have charged us with is to go smartly, go quickly, and go intelligently. We believe that what we put before you is the intelligent way to go. It's in size. I completely agree with that, but we're going to experiment with it. We're going to actually, quote unquote, break it, figure out what to do, learn with it, and then go forward. This is the way we go fast.
So I'll just add on, we're going to leverage a lot of work that we've already done with the Strategic Capabilities Office, particularly for the 20 ships. And so we've got those really kind of underway. And then for the follow-on, again, as the Secretary discussed, leveraging mature technology and then getting after those things with respect to autonomy and unmanned we just really have to explore those. And this is not a capability that we want to cede to the adversary because it's going to be decisive when we get it right. That's why we've parked it in the research and development line. I think that's the appropriate place to do work like this where so many questions remain to be explored.
Thank you to all of you. Mr. Scott, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, I think that hurricane hit Camp Lejeune September 14th. Is that date correct?
Yes, sir.
How are things at Camp Lejeune now?
There have been repairs made. The people are back occupying those buildings that they can still occupy. So there were 2 impacts. One was on the public housing, or the PPV housing. The vendor there has fixed about 50% of those houses. We've gone through and done what we could do with the appropriations and the resources we had, and we have reprogrammed some money, but we've come up with a list of about 31 buildings that we believe the cost of repair exceeds the value of the building and that it'd be better off to build new. Some of those buildings were already in the future program. We want to bring them to the left. But the end result is we have a bill, if you take away the $400 million that we got last week on reprogramming, we have a bill of about $3.1 billion over the next 3 or 4 years where we think where we need to fix the base so that we don't have to go through this again.
Is it safe to say that that things will continue to degrade unless some type of supplemental disaster assistance or appropriation is passed for Camp Lejeune?
Well, yes, they will. Otherwise, we're going to have to figure out how we're going to have to self-fund this. Mm-hmm. So whether there's reprogramming done within the department or there's a supplemental, we don't have insurance. The Congress is our insurance.
Yes, sir.
So
as is the White House. It's Congress and the White House. It takes both to get disaster relief passed.
Yes, sir.
Hurricane Michael hit my district, and we haven't received disaster assistance yet either. I know Vice President Pence, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, flew down there in 2 Marine Corps Ospreys on October 16th. We are with you, and we will stay with you until we rebuild and recover better than ever before, is the statement. And yet, to this day, we have not received a request for disaster assistance from the Office of Management and Budget. And I'm a little taken back with what's happened at Camp Lejeune and with the Corps and the damage and the need that you have for a supplemental appropriations bill, as well as the Air Force, who has basically had to take what they had in operation and maintenance money left over and use it to rebuild as best they can Tyndall. And now the Air Force is about to be in a situation where they're going to be stopping flying unless some type of supplemental appropriations is done. Congress is about to go on vacation for 2 weeks. The White House hasn't even submitted a request for assistance, and I'm embarrassed, quite honestly, that this job hasn't been done. Now, to be clear, there's politics being played on the Senate side. If the storm had hit Vermont, or if the storm had hit New York, or if the storm had hit a blue state, then senators from New York and Vermont would not be standing in the way of this package passing. But Have any of you talked with the White House about the need for a supplemental disaster assistance package?
Not directly, Congressman.
Secretary Spencer, I would suggest, I have a tremendous amount of respect for you. I have a tremendous amount of respect for both of you, too. But I think the number one thing you could do for the men and women in the Navy and the Marine Corps is to speak directly with the White House about the need for supplemental assistance. I do not think that the President of the United States, I do not think President Trump would be allowing Congress to go home for 2 weeks if he knew what was about to happen to the readiness of the Air Force and the Corps. I think that he would be challenging us on to stay here and get this job done, and I think that we could get beyond the petty politics in the Senate, but we want to be a part of the solution. I'm embarrassed that we're going home. These storms hit 7 months ago for you. They hit 6 months ago for me. Farmers in my area are filing bankruptcy, even though they were promised disaster assistance. It hasn't come. You guys need it just like we do. And I hope, Secretary, that you and the other secretaries will speak with the White House about the damage that's going to be done by not getting a disaster relief bill passed before we go home for Easter. Thank you. Thank you for your service.
Thank you. Mr. Golden.
Thank you. Secretary Spencer and Admiral Richardson, I want to talk just a little bit about shipbuilding readiness for a moment. The Navy's FY20 report to Congress on the annual long-range plan for construction of naval vessels noted, and that's a quote, that a healthy and efficient industrial base continues to be the fundamental driver for achieving and sustaining the Navy's baseline acquisition profiles, and that the shipbuilding base is a matter of national security that's unique and must be protected. As leaders, I know you both know from experience that producing people with the right skill sets isn't just not something that occurs overnight and takes a great deal of training and instruction. So I was very pleased by both of your remarks where you put an emphasis on the importance of education and training, as well as support for both public and private shipyards. And as you know, trained shipbuilders, we've got some great ones up at Bath Iron Works, and it's something that it requires some time and investment in workers. It typically takes like 5 to 7 years of training in order to get someone to achieve shipbuilding proficiency. And with the Navy's plans to expand the fleet, I wanted to hear your thoughts on what you're doing to encourage young men and women to enter into the shipbuilding profession, and what you're doing to help private and public shipyards with recruitment. I think about this in regards to younger folks, whether they're coming out of high school or looking to get into the trades, or even individuals like myself leaving the service who are looking for potential career opportunities. Is anything that you are doing with the shipyards for recruitment or training, and what can Congress do to assist and help you reach the objective?
Congressman, that's a great observation, and it's happening throughout the whole shipbuilding industry, both sides of the Mississippi, but I'm going to bring Maine out as a specific example. I was up there right after my confirmation hearing visiting Bath, and the community colleges in the area there had no exposure or no plans to have a curriculum to support what the basic skill sets are, nor the high schools. I was very encouraged on my last visit up a month ago to see that both the community college and the high schools are adopting primary skill sets and advanced curriculum in this area. I mean, it is across the board in the U.S., I think we have to address this, because at the end of the day, a level 3 welder and or any other artisan in the shipbuilding, aviation assembling field, it's a very nice career to have.
So I'll just pile on to what the Secretary said and add to my comments that this is really something that's exciting around the nation, and every one of our shipbuilding centers and ship repair centers as well, both public and private. With respect to the public shipyards, oftentimes we're sort of drawn from the same pool but it's really a team effort, right? We go out as a Navy and try and recruit. Some people want to ride and operate those ships as sailors. Some people want to design and build those ships as shipbuilders or ship repairers. But the apprentice programs, the teaming with the community colleges, even down to the high school level, they're really pulling out the stops, and they're responding to the demand signal for more shipbuilding, right? That's the thing that really is the most fundamental element of this. And so as we continue to grow the Navy, build more ships, they're gonna have places to go after they go through this training. So that's the most important thing.
Thank you for those thoughts, and I think the community colleges in Maine are doing a good job, and the unions have got some great apprenticeship training programs. They really make an investment in the workers and helping young people get set up for success. So I thank you for working to help them in any way that you can. And there's some interesting work being done in Maine with some individuals that are starting to get into the business of trying to recruit for the shipyard and going down, traveling around to bases and other places to show people that there's a good career waiting for them up in Maine. So I think there's a lot of potential there. Just real quickly, I wanted to give you an opportunity, Admiral. We heard from Vice Admiral Mers about the coming online of the Flight 3 DDG, and just wanted to hear your thoughts on what that's going to do to help the fleet, both in regards to new capabilities, but also your overall goal of getting to a fleet of 355.
I'll tell you what, the capabilities on the Flight 3 DDG, its sensors, its weapons, the whole, it just has a battle space control that is going to add a tremendous amount of capability, not only as a single ship, but in concert with the rest of the ships in the strike group and the fleet. And so as we think about distributed maritime operations, that type of capability is key. The fact that we're leveraging the learning curve that we've got already on the DDG 51 class and just modernizing that is also a benefit. And then we're looking for the next thing as well, because with the Flight 3, the DDG is about maxed out, not a whole lot more room to expand beyond that. And so working with industry, just as the Secretary said, to bring them in early to make sure we have a smoother transition to the next large surface combatant.
Thank you. Mr. Byrne for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Richardson and General Neller, I just want to say how much I appreciate your service to our country, and I want to tell you how much I appreciate your work with this committee and with me personally. It's been an honor and pleasure to know you and to work with you, and we wish you the best of luck in the years to come. Mr. Secretary, you have been very gracious in all the time you spent with me as you've heard my worries about the small service combatant program, and I'm very pleased to see that we're making the shift to the frigate in this year's budget. So I know you've worked very hard on that. Thank you. I do continue to be concerned about the price point, because we're now on the initial ship are up to almost $1.3 billion with additional requirements. And so what I worry about is, when we start getting these these acquisition programs, the costs up like this, we tend to cut back on the numbers. So are we still aiming for $800 million on the follow-on ships and still trying to get to 20?
That is correct, Congressman. If anything, and I share your consternation, we have, as you know, 5 robust platforms that we're going to be entertaining, which makes this probably one of the most competitive platform acquisition programs that we'll have, so we're quite excited about that. We look at the learning curves on those hulls that are already out there, and they're very impressive. The reason I pause for a second is that I read the latest GAO report on the Columbia, and one of the things that Navy is criticized for is not estimating the costs in an appropriate manner, that we underestimated. I'm hoping, and I'm pretty confident that the number that we're projecting here is the first ship number, and it's going to be a conservative number, but we are definitely driving for the $800 million number.
Well, good, because I don't think you're going to get to 20 if you jump it up much higher than 800. You know all the competition for the other ships that we're trying to construct, so please forgive me if I don't continue to bring that up. It's just a continued concern of mine.
Please do.
Yes, sir, I will. General Neller, I had the privilege of leading the HASC group that went out to RIMPAC last summer, and we were looking forward to getting underway on the Bonhomme Richard, but couldn't, because it couldn't sail. We were also supposed to have the Boxer out there, but it couldn't participate. I'm concerned about the amphibious program and our readiness. Do I have a legitimate concern? Do you have a concern about where we are on the amphib program?
We worked really hard with the Navy on the maintenance processes for amphib ships, and I believe the Navy has a backlog and a number of platforms for maintenance. So yes, we're concerned about the availability of these platforms. This is not something that happened overnight, and we've been funding maintenance and readiness at a higher level. So we're hoping to see a better availability of these ships, but it is something that the CO and I talk about, and he's tracking all this as we are, making sure that the platforms we do have are available and they have the mods and other changes they need. So we're not where we want to be, but we're continuing to work on it.
Thank you, General. Admiral, we continue to hear more and more about China and its naval operations, and presently around an island that's in dispute, or an island of rock that's in dispute between it and the Philippines. Can you enlighten us where we are on that?
Sir, I think the word for, the one word I would use to characterize that is consistency. Our actions are consistent with our words, and that's a very important body of water, the South China Sea, and about 1/3 of the world's trade goes through there. And so we've got tremendous national interest in making sure that trade flows freely through there, unthreatened. We've been consistently present in that part of the world for 70 years, and we're going to remain consistently present there and continue to advocate with our allies for free and open seas so that we fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows.
And I assume that the shipbuilding plan that you've submitted is your best estimate about what you're going to need short-term, near-term, and long-term to keep up with or stay ahead of the threat from the Chinese.
It's exactly addresses that strategy in every single hull, right? It's a very strategically informed budget, and so all of the entire budget really is leaning in that direction. Yes, sir.
Well, I thank you both, all three of you, for what you do. I think it's tremendously important to the defense of the country, and I certainly want to give my full support to all of your efforts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne. Mr. Norcross.
Thank you, Chairman, and I want to echo previous statements of thanking all of you for your service and wish you well as you move on in life. I know you won't go far. Secretary Spencer and Admiral Richardson, according to Naval Aviation long-term tactical aircraft inventory plans, 50-50 split is the percentage you're looking at between 4th and 5th generation fighters with the F-35C. The rationale between that 50-50 split across the entire globe, can you explain to us why you came up with the 50-50 split?
I'll take a first cut at that, Congressman, and then offer the CNO to dive in also. In the job here that I wear, wearing the Title X hat, it's portfolio management. Obviously, I'd love to have every single thing that I asked for, but I can't have it. When it comes to bringing the F-35 into the Navy fight, this is the most efficient and effective way that we believe we could do it, which is basically to feather in the F-35 Charlie, augmented by the Super Hornets, and that is both Super Hornet new and the SLEP program for the Super Hornet. So eventually we're getting to 100% 5th gen. We also have to figure in that we have the next generation fighter, which we're now just beginning to do some analysis on, and that should be brought into the argument also.
After the F-35, you're actually doing that analysis 30 years ahead or 20 years?
Yes, we're starting it now.
Admiral Richardson.
So I'll just echo what the Secretary said. I think he captured it completely. If you look at the capability of the future air wing, it's going to include that mixture of 4th and 5th gen, each of which contributes uniquely to the air power of that air wing. And then, of course, we're bringing in the unmanned tanker as well, so that we extend the range of that air wing and allow strike fighter aircraft to do the strike fighter mission instead of the tanking mission. And so it's really, a whole air wing approach as we move forward.
So as you move forward to 2030 and you start dealing with the near-peer competitors, particularly in the East China Sea, do you see that ratio changing over the course of the next 20 years?
We're going to stick with what we've got right now, sir, and we'll learn as we go forward. And then, as the Secretary said, we're already looking at what it's going to take to maintain air dominance even beyond fifth generation. And so we've got to start introducing that capability in the 2030s, and so it's time to get thinking about that now.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norcross. Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you. Secretary Spencer, your Navy cyber review, I believe, ID'd contractors as a huge vulnerability, really the soft underbelly of Navy cybersecurity. Just to follow up on what Representative Langevin talked about, could you please comment on the severity of the contractor threat? And if you would also address, I believe you're proposing a fifth Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity. The Navy already obviously has a CIO. You have an OPNAV cybersecurity division run by a two-star. So the proposal, I think, begs the question, what are those existing positions not empowered to do that you believe an Assistant Secretary for Cyber would be able to do?
To answer your two questions, Congressman, yes, one of the most vulnerable Achilles heels we have is our supplier base. And that, I think you appreciate, that ranges from Fortune 100 companies, Fortune 50 companies, on down to, I'll use the term mom and pop, the small business world. We have to be able to encompass and provide them avenues to protect our data. One reason that we're going to the cloud allows that ability to provide an avenue for some smaller organization to be encrypted, to be protected without encumbering a lot of cost on them. That is one of the things we're after. When it comes to the fifth Assistant Secretary, that will be the compilation of what we have in the organization already at the Secretariat level. And to remind you, Secretariat level is more we're a policy performer, and then the services themselves are the tactical enactors. So we'll be a support mechanism for that, providing the structure and the gray matter needed to actually put the policy out there and assist in the creation of the infrastructure around it.
And just, yes, Admiral.
If I could, sir, I'd just add on that we've taken some very near-term actions already, even before the cybersecurity study, in terms of tightening up the contractual relationship with a lot of those partners in the defense industrial base, and so encrypting their data at rest and in transit, two-method authentication, increasing the transparency into their systems, the oversight of those systems, the response of those systems, and so we're moving out with urgency here.
And Admiral Richardson, if I could, the National Defense Strategy obviously has this massive conceptual shift towards prioritizing great power competition, China, 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 and then Russia a distant second. But contained within that is this further conceptual shift away from reliance primarily on deterrence by punishment to doing more of deterrence by denial. How has that changed, sort of that big conceptual shift in that document, changed the way the Navy is doing business? And what role will the future frigate play in conducting deterrence by denial in the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, I would say that our conceptual approach to that, articulated in the Navy strategy, the design for maintaining maritime operations, is distributed maritime operations. And so the fundamental thesis of this is that we are going to complicate any adversary's targeting problem by distributing the platforms in the fleet, keeping that very distributed and dynamic, but having a network that will allow us to mass effects, whether the payloads, if you will, kinetic and non-kinetic. I'll tell you what, the frigate is going to contribute tremendously. It's going to pack a wallop, and it's going to allow us to get out there with a number of platforms and exercise this distributed maritime operations concept.
And then to follow up on that, General Neller, can you walk us through how you think U.S. withdrawal from the INF Treaty might affect your role in that fight, and specifically your EABO concept?
If we have the ability to deliver surface fires beyond the range that we are restricted by in INF, that'll put us in a better position vis-a-vis other adversaries out there. So in the EABO, Expeditionary Advanced Based Ops, we believe in conjunction with fleet operations and a naval campaign that we can use a land force to help control the maritime space. And so the longer range we have, the better opportunity we have to control greater pieces of the maritime space. So if you look at the critical geography on the globe, whether the maritime choke points, they're obviously where they are, if you control those and you have the ability to reach out and dominate the sea space from the land in support of the fleet and from the air, I think it gives you an operational advantage. And that's what we're going to try to do with these capabilities that we're going to develop. So we're lockstep with a lot of the weaponry development that the Army's doing, what the Navy's doing, with long-range anti-ship missiles and other things. There's capabilities out there, and we hope to field those and make that part of the naval campaign.
Thank you. I am out of time, but I think it also means we're going to have to teach a generation of young Marines what sea denial and sea control means and refresh that.
And I think we'll be able to do that because historically the seizure and securing of advanced naval bases in support of the naval campaign is what we have historically done. We haven't done it the last 17 years, as you rightly acknowledge and you know yourself. But I think that's going to be part of the education and training process, and we're moving out on that.
Absolutely. And thank you both for your service.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. Congresswoman Hill.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. Great to see you. Admiral Richardson, I hear lots about the talk about a bigger Navy and the need for the 355 ships, but I wanted to hear more about creating a ready Navy, what's being done differently after the McCain and Fitzgerald incidents, and to make sure that our destroyers are getting the maintenance they need. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yes, ma'am. First and foremost, with respect to the 7th Fleet, which is where we had our trouble, the most important thing we've done is just return schedule discipline to the force. Admiral Sawyer out there, the 7th Fleet Commander, Admiral Aquilina, the Pacific Fleet Commander, are supporting this with vigor. And so what this really means practically is that we don't send a warship out to do a mission until it's been trained and certified to do that mission, and we've provided adequate time and oversight to make sure that they're ready to go. Backing that up, we stood up a new command out there in Japan to make sure that there's an on-site advocate for force generation so that we get to that level of readiness, and that's stood up and working very well. And then as we go into deeper matters, we've adjusted the training profile for each of those ships. We're moving simulators, high-end simulators, out to each of the fleet concentration areas, especially and including our forward deployed naval forces. And then we've changed the career path for surface warfare officers to make sure that they get better and more training as they go through their career.
So do you feel like the maintenance needs are being met for the destroyers, or?
I'll tell you, maintenance has been a topic of conversation here at the hearing all morning, and it is probably our remaining most complicated Gordian knot to untie. And so we've got everything leaning into this. We're using the same practices that we use to improve an aircraft maintenance, going out into the private sector to look at best practices. We're starting to use a very data-centric approach. There has been some good progress made in maintenance, but we've still got a ways to go.
Thank you. Okay, so then this is in a different direction, but my brother is enlisted already. He's scheduled to go out for boot at the end of May, so very excited about that. But I was hoping you could talk about what the Navy's doing to hit its future recruitment targets. I know you mentioned earlier that there's as many as a 6,500 billet shortage, so anything you can talk about?
I'll tell you what, ma'am. Knock on wood, but both the Commandant and I have enjoyed the fact that we've hit our recruiting targets for probably the last 12 years on a month-by-month basis. And I think that has a lot to do with the same factors that you're seeing in your family in terms of what draws our nation's young people to the service. It's as competitive a space as I've got anywhere, is the competition for talent. The recruiting team is doing great work. We're using some very new techniques, kind of web-based approaches to this. It's part of our transformation of our personnel and pay system, and that's yielding some pretty good results. I will tell you what, also, once you arrive at boot camp, it's a completely different scenario. You're going to learn resilience. You're going to learn so many skills there. We've actually made it tougher, but we've done it in a way that we're actually retaining more people. The graduation rate is higher even after we've made those adjustments, because we're teaching people how to manage that stress in a much more effective way. And then finally, we have to stay true to our values, which I think is the thing that attracts our young people more than anything else.
Of course. So if the recruitment targets are being met, where are those shortages coming from, the 6,500 shortages?
This is really a leftover, if you will, from a shortage that we experienced in recruiting in 16. And so as you think about that divot moving through time, It's going to be with us until it passes through the senior ranks, but that's where we are. The most recent recruiting numbers have been much better, and we're going to see this recover, I think, in the next year or two.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. And Admiral, I was just out at Great Lakes Training Center and saw the transformation that Admiral Bernanke has brought out there, and everything you described is absolutely true. The morale and enthusiasm was off the chart, and he was making it tougher. Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, Admiral, we're going to be sorry to see you retire. For General Neller, I understand you're going out to Las Vegas and with Buck Bedard open up a casino. Is that correct?
No, Congressman, that's not correct.
Just you, huh? Anyway, I did want to talk about amphibious ships and the fact that two of them were cut out of the budget. Correct me if I'm wrong, LPDs. How much of an impact is that going to have on commitments?
There was LPD Flight 2 and an LHA, which were moved to the right in this in the program. So we've discussed, and there was advanced procurement money provided by the Congress for both of those platforms. And so in discussions yesterday and with other hearings, we believe with incremental funding, if that was permitted by the Congress, that we could probably bring those back to the left. Are they important? Yes. We still have a requirement for 38 amphib ships. We believe 12 big decks and 26 LPD similar hull forms. And so we would like to get to 38 ships. But there's other competing requirements. I understand that. Obviously, we believe that amphibs obviously are critically important in Marines, but submarines are important in Marines too, because if we don't have submarines, we're not going to get to the fight. I have to be, as a member of the Joint Chiefs, I have to be operationally, intellectually honest about that. But as a Marine, we need both more platforms and we need more availability from the platforms we have. So I believe if we work with the Congress on be able to spend this advanced procurement with some incremental funding, I think we can move for sure the LPD Flight 2 hull form, get it sooner than where it is in the program.
Sir, if I could just pile on to my partner here, is we see it the exact same way. Even with these adjustments, we are going to have 36 amphibious ships at the end of the 5-year program in FY24 against a requirement for 38, so we're taking this very seriously. With that incremental funding authority, we could get started on that LPD as soon as we get those authorities and maybe even do better than that.
I wanted to address something that's often, I think, forgotten in the budget, and that's the Mount Warfare Training Center. And you know, this thing's been around since the 50s, the reaction to the Korean War. I think it's a great training area. I was there many, many years ago, and there's a certain part of my exterior that still hasn't thawed out since the 60s, I guess I was there. The problem, I was there recently and very, very concerned about the fire danger. As you know, you can still see the red lines where the planes, it was very, very close. And the other problem is they had a great exercise up there, but I was concerned with the helicopters and everything else because there's no security for those things. You got to have troops out there. That road that they have that they goes, it's like 50 miles away, or excuse me, it's like maybe 50, 100 meters away from where the helicopters were set for the evening during that exercise. So I'm just hoping that we can work with the Park Service, the Forestry Service, and straighten out that road, whether we have to get money or what have you. And if you could, I'm going to be studying it more and more, and any suggestions you have, because it's been like that for too long. And sooner or later, we're going to have a problem there with fires or interlopers with some very expensive equipment. And the great exercise, I thought it was fantastic. But any comments on that? I don't have.
Congressman, I was just up there, and they briefed me on that that northern part of the training area they want to open up in the particular roads you're referring to. So I'll get back to you with whatever particular initiatives that we need. Maybe you can help us with the Park Service to be able to improve that road and be able to open up that training area, at least for maneuver, and also so we can get into the training area from a different direction in case we have an issue that we need to address. But I'll owe you that, and I'll get back to you on that.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Congresswoman Luria.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. One of the things that strikes me the most when I look at the budget is the changes year over year to a 30-year shipbuilding plan, and I'm just trying to wrap my head around why there's so many changes in just 1 year. A few examples. In last year's 30-year shipbuilding plan, we had no cruiser decommissionings through 2023. This year we have 6. We had 3 minesweeper decommissionings. Now we have 11. We're going to decommission a carrier halfway through its 50-year life cycle. And the ship-to-shore connector, we've gone from 8 to 0. I'd assume when we generate a 30-year shipbuilding plan that it would be pretty consistent year over year in the nearest years. And the way I see a 20-year shipbuilding plan at this point, it's like the Navy's Vision 2050. And if that vision changes every year, do we really have a clear vision? An example I'll give from a hearing in 2015, Rear Admiral Manazir, the Air Boss, said, and I quote, "This force structure assessment," he was talking about the 2014 one, "is sized for a U.S. Navy force to conduct a complex, multi-phase campaign against a high-end adversary in one region and to deter or impose costs in another region. This force is designed to do that all the way to 2030. So that force structure was 308. The next year in the new force structure assessment, we said it was 355, and as we know, we're pending a new force structure assessment, which you've stated is going to even have a higher number. So why are there so many changes year over year, and do we really have a long-term vision towards 2050 for the Navy?
Ma'am, I think the answer to both of those questions is yes, we have a long-term vision. What has happened since 2016, I think, is indicative of just exactly how fast and quickly both the security environment is changing and also the technology landscape is changing. So each one of those platforms that you mentioned has its own justification. We're going to continue to assess the cruisers. We're going to not propose them for life extension, but we're going to take this year and study that to see if it is a good return on the taxpayers' investment, given the warfighting punch that they bring. With respect to the mine countermeasure ships, we're going
so
to...
just in the interest of time, not to go line by line, it was really about a bigger vision, not
we
each
do
of
have
the
a vision,
things,
but we also are operating in an extremely dynamic security and technology environment, and so I think that's why we're doing the force structure assessment. I would just say that I don't think I've predicted it's going to be higher or lower. I really am letting that run.
Okay, well, I'll look forward to those results. Yes, so, Secretary Spencer, so one of the main things that concerns me is the continuous change and churn that we have within the Navy. In my own 20-year career, for example, the surface warfare training pipeline changed 4 times. Again, I think an indication of no real vision. And, you know, we did have the terrible collisions in the Pacific in 2017, and we're implementing corrective actions for that part of our training. But I see the same thing in this year's budget and shipbuilding plan, more change, more churn. And I understand that technology changes, our potential adversaries change, as do their capabilities. But what do you think about the fact that it appears to the outside observer that the Navy doesn't have a shipbuilding plan that can stand for more than 1 year without significant changes?
It doesn't bother me whatsoever, Congresswoman, because the fact of the matter is we are adapting to the changes around us. The fact that we have accidents in the Pacific and we make a change to correct it, that is change. I don't think that's churn. I would hope that you would want me to be running at full speed, and when I run at full speed, I'm going to adapt and adopt and experiment as much as I can.
Okay, so Admiral Richardson, with regards to the OFRP, CVN 77 recently entered Norfolk Naval Shipyard for a 28-month availability. Was 28 months ever part of the planned OFRP cycle?
Ma'am, it was originally in for a 16-month, that was what it was planned for.
And so Ike also finished their maintenance availability a year late recently, and they were the first to go through an OFRP cycle, is that correct?
They were one of the first, but I will tell you that this 28 is really a recognition that there is some emergent material issues that we've got to do that were not part of the original plan, and so we're recognizing that.
Are you able to consistently provide a 2+3 carrier presence over the FIDP?
For the most part, yes. Sometimes maintenance prevents us from doing that, but we're certainly striving towards that by the end of the fit-up.
So is the OFRP producing the deployed presence that was envisioned and testified to this committee in 2015? Because at that time, in the same hearing that we're having now, everyone affirmed that the minimum number of carriers to produce an acceptable level of risk is 11. So why in the 30-year shipbuilding plan do you not maintain, as required by law, the 11 carriers?
I think that with respect to the Truman overhaul, I think is where your question is centering, is we have to consider that as sort of a number of interrelated things. One is that we are biased towards naval power, and that that naval power may be maximized by some of these new technologies that are coming down right around the corner. The Harry S. Truman also delivers a tremendous amount of naval power. Resolving all that is being evaluated in this force structure assessment that you've referred to, as well as the combatant commanders updating their O plans. When we see those O plans and that assessment done, we're in a perfect position to respond to it.
As I see we're out of time.
Okay, I think our time's run out, so thank you, Congresswoman. Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Spencer, my constituents in Pensacola love their Blue Angels. I'm hopeful that your budget fully supports the Blue Angels.
It does this time, sir. Yes.
And would you comment about the role that the Blue Angels play and how important they are in the overall Navy?
Blue Angels are one of our key recruiting tools for the United States Navy. The Blue Angels, in concert with our TAC Demo Legacy Flight, really are one of the go-getters when we go out to air shows to help the recruiting effort.
We're proud of them. I would have to say, Admiral Richardson, I'm a little less proud of how we've dealt with some of these physiological episodes and how we've dealt with some of the training deaths. Would you comment on how the budget we have now leans into a solution set so that we don't continue to have those, particularly on the Goshawk?
Yeah, I think that first I want to come and brief you, because I think when you get the details, you would be proud. And we've attacked this from a multidisciplinary approach, not only in the Navy, but we've employed NASA, the private industry, and just about everybody who can help us here. We've employed the diving community to help us understand this better. It's about as complicated a problem as you can describe, the interface between a high-performance aircraft and a human body. But we're stepping through in a very disciplined way. We've seen in general the trend of those physiological episodes go down, in some cases almost being eliminated from certain type model series, and we look forward to making future progress.
I look forward to that briefing. One of the concerns I have is that when I visited NAS Pensacola, only one of the training simulators had a hypoxia-enabled OBOG system. And what I heard from the leadership and the students there is that if all of the students know that there is but one simulator that has the hypoxia simulation, then it misses the point of training students how to diagnose a physiological episode and then deal with their emergency protocols. Is there any thought given to how we train those students to react to those symptoms? And is it your view that maybe having more than one trainer with the hypoxia-enabled OBOG system might assist in that training?
I will say that a consistent approach to us responding to this is to increase the training across the entire naval aviation enterprise in terms of how pilots recognize and respond to a potential physiological episode in the air. I'm not sure exactly how the trainer in Florida relates to that higher.
Well, no, you would understand, though, that if there's sort of one system with that feature and the other systems don't have that feature, then you would expect that feature in the system that you knew had it and not in the systems that didn't. Just it was sort of a common sense reaction from some of the students. So I hope you'll take that in consideration as the Navy continues to address the problem. I wanted to shift gears and follow up on Mr. Langevin's questions about climate change. Admiral Richardson, what elements of the budget that the Navy's presented would we look to say that they acknowledge the challenges associated with climate change, that they lay out a strategy to deal with it?
Sir, I would point you to our MILCOM budget first and foremost, and the guidance that we've put out that anything new that's built has to be considerate of potential sea level rises and other factors of climate change. We're also working very closely, not just isolating to the on-base problem, but working closely with local communities, because typically we're right there with our neighbors in places like San Diego, Norfolk in particular, and other places.
Yeah.
So it's the MILCOM budget where I would
appreciate that on basing, but for years I've heard my colleague, Mr. Garamendi, mention the impacts of climate change on the permissibility of the environment in the Arctic. We've heard chiefs from the Air Force and the Army testify that climate change impacts the permissibility of various environments, and they specifically reference the Arctic. Do you similarly hold that view, or is there a different view you hold?
I think we probably are first among equals in terms of the impact. Sea lanes are open now that weren't open before. Continental shelves are exposed now that weren't open before. The Arctic ice cap is as small as it's been in our lifetime. That's why we're invested up there. We took the Harry S. Truman Strike Group north of the Arctic Circle last year for the first time since 1991. We've had a consistent submarine program, including ICEX last year, where we surfaced 2 U.S. submarines and a British submarine through the ice. We have a robust program of exercises that we have been conducting and plan to continue to conduct in the Arctic to make sure that we can operate up there.
Is it fair to say then that you are having to react to the impacts of climate change in real time as they impact environments that our adversaries are interested in?
It's absolutely fair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Mr. Garamendi.
Mr. Gantz, thank you for raising that issue. It saves me the time, and we do pay attention to polar security cutters. Thank you. Secretary Spencer, thank you for sharing information and time. Admiral Richardson, the same. You've been very forthcoming. I appreciate it. General Neller, I think you and I, not you, but I'll be visiting your folks in Lejeune a little later this afternoon. In fact, shortly after this question ends. With regard to Camp Lejeune, we've had a full discussion. We'll have more as a result of the visit that Mr. Lamboyd and I will be making today. General Neller, you've spoken to the issue of the deployment of troops, your troops, to the border wall and the readiness issues that have occurred as a result of that. I would appreciate later more information about specificity, specifically what you were referring to, Now, with regard to the issue that Mr. Wilson raised with regard to sea lift, we need to revisit the current NDAA as we prepare for the next NDAA and be really drilling down on what ships are going to be needed sooner than later. You mentioned this, Admiral Richardson. Of particular concern to mine is information that was given to us with regard to specialty ships that service other ships, and that they seem to be aging out sooner than later. So I'd like to have more full information on that and try to design that into the current NDAA and the timing issues surrounding that. So if you could give that information to us. Finally, with regard to MILCON, there is no way that we can avoid the fact that $6 to $8 billion is likely to be taken out of the current MILCON programs if the President is successful with his program. We need to know soon, like now, what programs are at risk, given the President's desire to take that money and spend it on the border wall. So for all three of you, if you could immediately, like when we return after the Easter recess, have that information in hand. We do know that $1 billion has already been taken out of the defense budget to be used on three contracts. The legality of that is questionable, but nonetheless, that appears to have happened. We'll be looking at that. So $1 billion is already gone. So I want to have very specific information upon our return as to what projects are at risk. And I think it is a fool's errand to assume that that money will be replaced in the coming appropriations. So that's money that is likely not to be available in the future. And we need to know the impact of it. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Waltz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I specifically want to thank both of your families, Admiral General, for, I think it's probably safe to say you're both in your dream jobs right now, but your families have borne the brunt of your service, and I always want to keep the families in mind. I want to talk a bit about the submarine threat Admiral Richardson, the evolution of the Chinese and Russian, my understanding in simple terms, Chinese are really ramping up production and numbers. The Russians in terms of approaching parity in quality. Can you share with us some of the successes you've had in tracking the recent out-of-area submarine deployments by the Chinese and the Russians? I understand that the P-8 has been instrumental. Its sonobuoy processing capabilities are critical to that success. And then if you could talk to me about sonobuoys in your funded and then your unfunded priorities.
Yeah, sir. I mean, what I think I need to do is come back and give you a classified brief on that. It's almost impossible to talk about that
Fair enough.
Unclassified forum. But I will say that in this venue that ASW has really become a team sport. It involves not only submarines, but also surface ships, their towed array sonars, their radars, and then, as you mentioned, the P-8s and their sonobuoys. It all works together as a team, and we're getting more and more participation with our allies who can keep with us at that high end as well. With respect to sonobuoys, it is, it's like every other, it's like a piece of ordnance. When, you expend it, and it's done, and you need to kind of keep replenishing that. And as we continue to ramp up our capability, we're finding that we need to replace those sonobuoys at an increasing rate, and so our budget supports them.
Great. In terms of, again, sticking to the Chinese and where they're going, a number of studies that I've read, they're producing, and setting the qualitative parts of this aside, we're looking at 2 to 3 ships to 1 in terms of their production. I mean, it is one of the largest shipbuilding, they have one of the largest shipbuilding capabilities in the world by far. Is there as you're looking at your studies and in your studying the force structure, isn't there a kind of a quality to quantity in and of itself? And looking at the high-low mix and looking at the cost savings of refurbishing frigates in particular at a fraction of the cost. So if these trends continue, do you agree with the assessments that quantitatively the Chinese will be on parity by 2030 and qualitatively, actually, let's say quantitatively exceed, qualitatively approaching parity by 2030?
Well, certainly they're the #1 shipbuilder in the world, right? And so from a quantitative standpoint, it's, they're ahead.
Maybe you can just add to your comments, you had mentioned some incentives that you're looking at increasing our shipbuilding, domestic shipbuilding.
I would be willing to participate in a discussion to do everything we can to incentivize and increase domestic shipbuilding I think it's a national strategic imperative, and so there's a number of things that we might be able to do, and I'd look forward to the discussion, sir. And then with respect to the qualitative, I think we're going to continue to do our best to stay ahead from a qualitative standpoint from any other Navy in the world.
Congressman, just to add something to that's going to inform our discussions, our acquisition and sustainment arm through Secretary Gertz is actually doing a what happens when the balloon goes up with industry. We're having a forum that America's Arsenal or the Freedom's Forge. It's that whole concept of what would happen to capacity and what could our suppliers expect to do if, in fact, we really surged the demand. That's happening the end of May. It's going to be interesting. We'll let you know.
New investments in modernizing the reserve fleet, which is sitting around 40 to 45 years. How are we going to address that, and how is the Navy? I mean, I understand it's not the sexy end of shipbuilding, but just assure this committee that you're taking that seriously.
Totally. This is square in my wheelhouse. Again, it comes to portfolio management, and I don't say that apologetically. That's how we're trying to balance this whole investment process, Congressman. The CNO gave you the overview. One of the things that I'd love to plant as an ask is the ability to buy more foreign used. Yes, we need to get our shipbuilding muscles back in shape, but in the immediacy, you've given me the ability to buy 2 and then go forward with champs, and then I can buy 3 more. I would like to have more the ability to have X dollars in an account and go out to the marketplace and buy as much as I could with that money.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Waltz. And the MARAD actually is going to be coming out with its maritime policy, which hasn't been updated since the 1930s. And we'll certainly going to have a hearing at Sea Power when that day comes, shortly, hopefully. Now I'd like to recognize the ranking member on the Sea Power Subcommittee, my friend, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Spencer, Admiral Richardson, General Neller, thank you so much for joining us. And Admiral Richardson, General Neller, thanks so much for your leadership, for your vision, and for your direction in your tenures there as chiefs. We appreciate that tremendously. I think you have really moved the ball forward for our nation's Navy and Marine Corps, and we appreciate that, created a legacy for many years to come. General Neller, I want to build on some comments that you've made concerning the devastation at Camp Lejeune from Hurricane Florence. As you pointed out, significant impact there. $3.6 billion of damage, $2 billion going towards demolition and rebuilding of those buildings, $1.3 billion going to fixing existing buildings, and about $300,000 going to fix IT systems and other repairs. So pretty significant. Your comment was this specifically. You said, if the Marine Corps had to fund that through its existing military construction budget, it would take that budget in its entirety for about 4 years. That's a tremendous impact. I want to get your perspective. Where does that leave not only Camp Lejeune operationally, but where does it leave the operational capability of 2MEF in its ability to respond to crisis? Because, you know, we can look at buildings and those sorts of things and really just make it about bricks and mortar, or we can really talk about what does it do to affect operational capabilities. So could you give us that perspective on where things are with the Marine Corps?
Well, Congressman, I appreciate the question. Obviously, 2MEF remains an operational capable headquarters,
yeah,
and a command element, and the Marines and their families that live and train and operate out of there are ready to go today. They're operating in a degraded environment, and we expect to do that when we forward deploy in an expeditionary scenario. We don't necessarily expect to do that when we're at home station. So over a period of time, I think it will. It could affect a lot of things. It could affect retention. It could affect our ability. Some of the ranges and training areas have been degraded. The beach area and access to the beach. You know, the shoreline on the East Coast is changing over time because of all the storms we've had. So it affects our ability to use that beach because that's a training beach. So some of the range areas, I think, are back in business because we had to clear some areas. So the impact on the New River and the Cherry Point side, you're operating in hangars where the office spaces and the planning spaces are degraded. And so, you know, we expect our folks, when they forward deploy, to operate in austere conditions. We don't necessarily expect them to operate in that environment when they're at home station. So they're willing to put up with it for a while if they know there's a remedy coming, and we need to be able to offer them that remedy. This is not just an all-volunteer force, it's an all-recruited and all-retained force, and we need to provide them some level of capability at home station. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it's got to be better than what we got down at Lejeune right now.
Very good. Thank you, General Neller. Secretary Spencer, I wanted to get your perspective on some comments that have been made by members of this committee with some concerns about what has happened recently. Their comments have been about taking away reprogramming authority. And as we know, reprogramming authority gives some flexibility, and we're just talking about the impact of the storms on Camp Lejeune, on Tyndall Air Force Base. So I wanted to get your perspective. How would you see the impact in your role and your capability there in making the necessary adjustments for a Navy Marine Corps team if that reprogramming authority was completely taken away from you?
Congressman, as I know you appreciate, because we've walked through this before, when we assemble the budget, we try to make it as tight and as focused as possible, but in the ever-changing world that we deal with, there's continual adjustments that have to be made, whether it be the purchase of armaments, whether it be maintenance, which is one of my biggest reprogramming drivers, it would be devastating to lose the reprogramming capability, sir.
Gotcha. Very good. Admiral Richardson, I wanted to build a little bit on your comments on the FY20 budget and how your focus is on preserving the industrial base. I think that's absolutely critical. But if you look at that, you see that there are no requests for additional construction for amphibious ships. The ship-to-shore connectors were taken out. We heard that referred to earlier. CVN 75, refueling. So the question becomes, if we're really about maintaining the industrial base as well as building that capacity, it does seem to be somewhat of a contradiction with those missing elements of what's in the budget request to your efforts to say that, we want to make sure that we are multi-purposing in this effort to assure we have industrial capacity and capability at the same time that we're rebuilding the proper components of the fleet. So I just want to get your perspective on that.
And if you could make it sort of a shortened version,
sure.
That would be great. Thanks. Yep.
Sorry, Mr.
Abbreviated
Chairman.
version. Sir, I mean, we built 12 ships over in this budget, 55 over the fit-up. With some authorities, we could get started on the amphib ship and bring it back in and get started on that as quickly as we can. And so I think we do show a commitment there to shipbuilding and the national treasure that is the shipbuilding industrial base.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks
Thank you, Mr. Whitman. Thank you to the witnesses for your endurance. There actually is a request for a couple follow-up questions by some of the members. And again, at this point, I just want to yield to Mr. Thornberry, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary and Admiral, Ms. Loria kind of started down this road, but nobody's really pressed y'all on why the administration request is walking away from 25 years left of a carrier life. So I think we need to hear that explanation, and then the part B of that is if and I think the prevailing opinion in this committee is to refuel the carrier. Okay, if that's our decision, then what are you not able to do in the future, given the budgets that you assume are coming?
Congressman, let me walk you through the thought process. When we sat down to create the budget, then Deputy Secretary Shanahan really had us go through what I consider a very healthy assessment of where we are. And if you look at United States Navy, which probably has the largest installed base of capital assets, there are three buckets that we have, which is our legacy systems, the modernization of our legacy systems, and then the funding of what I'm going to call R&D and or Force 2.0, those weapons that are being developed now and those to come that we have to invest in. If we look at the two-carrier buy combined with the non-refueling of the Truman, the thought process was as follows. One, and I think this is lost in some of the conversations, the Ford-class carrier is not a Nimitz in any way. It has a 30% higher projection of a sortie launch, 25% fewer people to man it. We're expecting maintenance to be less. That will be proven out. If that's the case, we're modernizing the fleet. I look at, again, outside the wire, anywhere from oil industry to aviation to trucking. When, in fact, a new platform is presented to anyone who's modernizing in the 20% improvement range, people abandon assets to make the case to move towards more effective, more efficient, in our case, more lethal platforms. So this is not a one-to-one trade. This is modernizing the fleet with three platforms right off the bat that are more lethal. That was the thought process behind the Truman. Walking away from 25 years, abandoning an asset is not an easy decision. Where we are right now in the actual process, we can still come back to address it. The Joint Chiefs are doing studies, so are we, as far as requirement goes. But as far as a modernization argument, we believed it was a way to put the statement forward that we can take those monies and invest in Force 2.0, whether that be more submarines, whether that be advanced systems, whether that be future weapons that we don't have yet that we have to invest in.
We're obviously going to have a fair number of Nimitz-class carriers out on the seas. So I take your point. A new carrier is better than an old carrier, but an old carrier has substantial value, don't you think?
It has value, sir, but the business case is to what investment, to what I get on the other side of investing in new weapons.
Okay, and Admiral, I'd appreciate your comments, but also the second part of my question is if we disagree and we say you're going to refuel the carrier, then what budget implications does that have for y'all in the coming years?
Sir, I'll just echo what the Secretary said, that one, the budget submission is about addressing the strategic priorities, which place a great responsibility on maximizing naval power. And how we do that going forward, first of all, the investment in the Ford class, I think, to me, says that the aircraft carrier continues to be a relevant part of delivering naval power into the future. So there's been a lot of conversations about the vulnerability of the aircraft carrier, et cetera. A competently run aircraft carrier in a distributed maritime operations environment is a very lethal platform. And it's not the carrier itself, although this carrier is much better than the other. It's actually, innovation takes place on the air wing, and that is the striking power of the aircraft carrier. With respect to the balance between the Nimitz class and new technology, I think that's why we have to study this, which is why we have these studies going on in parallel to this, and also the industrial base, which has been mentioned a number of times. What is the impact of the industrial base of these decisions? And so it is about that balance, just as the Secretary articulated, whether we move forward and invest in some of these technologies or whether we deliver on a proven platform that will deliver new technologies through its air wing. And so I think we're in a position that wherever those studies take us in parallel with this decision, we can respond. If you were to restore the overhaul of the carrier, then we would just adjust our investments into some of those other parts of the budget. I think if it was consistent with the logic, we would draw off of some of that new technology investment. There'll be a considerable amount remaining, and we'll look for other less lethal places to find that money.
Okay. I would just say my sense is we ought to be having those conversations, and I understand your point, but if that's the way it goes, then it may have implications that we need to talk about. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're back.
Thank you, Mr. Thornberry. So again, just kind of get situational awareness here. We've got two members who have follow-up questions. We've already had one pass through, but we've been joined by Mr. Banks, who again was not able to be here for his first round of questioning. So Mr. Banks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Spencer, I recently introduced a piece of legislation to create military education savings accounts for military families. I don't know about you, but I've heard from so many military families and our men and women in uniform who go through that difficult process of moving from one installation to another, having their children placed in a good school in one place, but finding poor education options when they move to a new location. I wonder, do you hear those same complaints from families? There was a recent Military Times study that suggested that nearly half of our service members have either left the service or thought about leaving the service because of poor education options for their children. I don't know if you could have any remarks about that?
Congressman, yes. The way that I hear it is the inconsistency of the education available to those that are transferred around. There is a lack of consistency.
So you do hear from our sailors about that,
Yes.
the difficulty of that. I understand that you have been in contact with the Department of Education about that.
Yes, we have.
Education savings accounts, and is that a concept that appeals to you? That
Appeals.
would appeal to our families, our military families across the country?
To those that are educated on it on a launch basis, yes.
Okay. I appreciate your brevity, but is there a good way to with your business experience? Is there a good way to create a path toward creating an option like that for our families through the DoD? And would the Department of Navy potentially be interested in a pilot program that empowering the Navy to create?
I'll turn it over to the CNO, but as far as a businessman wearing my Title 10 hat, would love to see the option available.
Sir, I'll tell you, probably one of the most exciting parts of what's going on in the Navy right now is how we're transforming the way we do our human resourcing. And so we're very soon, with the Congress's support in terms of revolutionizing this, going to be able to understand the individual priorities of every one of our sailors, which would include their families and their education. And so we'll know better that if a sailor wants to achieve some geographic stability because he wants to put his kids through school, we'll have some options that we can appreciate and offer him as a part of his compensation package. It's really becoming a much more dynamic marketplace with the sailors increasingly participating in their future destiny, all the while meeting the needs of the Navy and the nation. And so this is an exciting part. If a pilot program that would further enhance a sailor's ability to control their own destiny, educate their children, we'd be excited to participate in something like that. As I end 37 years, we have 5 children. We've moved 21 times. We've experienced this personally, and it's something that we need to make as smooth as possible.
I appreciate that very much. As the NDAA soon approaches us, perhaps we could work with you to see if the Navy might be the best home for such a pilot program to support our military families as they face this this difficult issue. I don't have more, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back with that. But this is an important subject. Something that I hear from so many families about is as they make that tough journey in their service and faced our military families they're the last families that should be faced with the stress of choosing whether to send their children to a bad school or poor performing school because they're moved to a new station, and it's something I think this committee ought to do a lot more about. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. Congresswoman Luria.
Well, thank you, and I wanted to pick up Admiral Richardson where we left off, because the current law says that we need to have 11 aircraft carriers, but you're bringing us a budget that actually is asking us in your 30-year shipbuilding plan to never attain that goal. So can you explain the disconnect? Are you coming to us and asking us to change the law about the number of carriers that we need?
I'm not aware of any legislative proposal to change the law there yet. It takes a while to get up to 12. It's outside the 30-year shipbuilding plan by the time we reach 12.
Well, I understand that, but we voluntarily let ourselves dip to 9 when we could have been at 10 during those time frames. My next question, and this is something that Chairman Forbes asked during a previous hearing when he was still here, has the United States Navy ever made the determination that the presence of an aircraft carrier strike group has had a significant role in deterring a conflict from going from phase 0 to phase 3?
The answer to that is yes.
Okay.
It's a tremendously cost-imposing thing. That's kind of that's a difficult question to answer briefly, but and deterrence is a difficult thing to measure in general. How did something not happen? But
so Secretary Stackley's response at the time was that he would go as far to say that it's the cornerstone of our maritime strategy. Yep. Do you, in principle, agree with that assessment?
It is the fundamental fighting element of the United States Navy right now.
Okay. And Secretary Spencer, you quoted some efficiencies that we gained through the Ford-class aircraft carrier, and one of those is that you assessed that the maintenance costs go down by 20%. So the Ford-class carrier cycle, and this was also previously reported in a hearing before the Congress, is that cycle is 43 months versus the 36 months that we have for the Nimitz class. Which should allow the ship to deploy more frequently over its life cycle, only have to dry dock once every 12 years, and result in this overall 20% reduction in maintenance. However, we're still planning to operate on the 36-month cycle, so it doesn't appear that although we have built an efficiency of having a 43-month cycle, more availability to deploy and more presence, that we're actually planning to execute to that and take advantage of the 20% reduction in maintenance that this should afford us. Can you explain that disconnect?
I think you'll see us work that into the plan.
So then would the OFRP change and all surface combatant cycles would extend to 43 months?
I'll let the CNO address that, but if in fact we have the efficiencies, I don't know why we wouldn't accept and avail ourselves to them. But it's not universal across all forms.
Yeah, ma'am, as you alluded, we're going to have to take a look at the escorts, the auxiliary ships and everything that supports that strike group, the air wing, and so it really is a force that deploys together. The fact that we designed in 20% less maintenance costs, we certainly intend to take advantage of that, whether it's a 36 or a longer month OFRP.
Okay.
And the OFRP in general is designed to be dynamic. We've changed it several times, as you and I have discussed. I mean, this is not something that is written in stone. It will change as well to respond to circumstances.
Thank you. And so over the course of several hearings that we've had on this topic, both in the full hearing as well as within Sea Power, I've tried to distill the difference between actual presence versus availability to deploy and surge capability that you're creating with the OFRP. And I just wanted to close out my comments with something that Secretary Mabus said during his last hearing before this committee. His quote is, "While there's been discussion about posture versus presence, the simple fact is that for the Navy and Marine Corps, our posture is presence, and there is no next best thing to being there. Maintaining that presence requires gray hulls on the horizon." And have you changed in views, Mr. Secretary, from your predecessor as far as the importance of presence? And we've seemed to have emphasized surge capability over presence. Can you comment on that?
A policeman on every corner will deter crime. I'd love to have a gray hull on every corner. I do not have that luxury. So it's a portfolio management, risk management model that I must deal with. Yes, posture is presence, and yes, that is a deterrent. I have to use it judiciously, or I can produce it judiciously for the COCOMs to use judiciously.
Okay, and why is it that they are not getting their requested amount? I've had the opportunity to ask 3 COCOMs before this committee what percentage of presence they're getting versus their request, and CENTCOM said about 1/5, EUCOM 1/3, and PACOM, obviously they have the additional presence of the carry-on station in 7th Fleet, said about 70%. So is there a disconnect in the process by which the COCOMs are requesting this, but we're not providing that? Or do we need to look at the realism of the request that they're making versus off the threats in their theater?
I'll let the CNO dive in here also, but I mean, it is a supply-demand, and we try to do the best we can, obviously, managing the risk that we have. I'm sure as a combatant commander, the balancing threat versus asset is a model they have to deal with. They feed it into the machine, they feed it into our request. We have the assets that we can provide to them.
If I could just pile onto that, General Neller and I both worked in the part of the Joint Staff that sort of did this math over time. I think historically we meet about 50% of the combatant commanders' requests as a joint force, and that would include the Navy if you average everything out. And it goes to exactly what the Secretary said. It's a matter of what forces are available versus the demand. The difference in that is risk, and we prioritize our presence so that we can minimize our global risk. That again is a very dynamic scenario, and so we work that continuously, but every year they redo the entire plan. And so one thing we have to also address is that we don't overdrive the force employment part of the equation so that we underdrive the training, maintenance, training, and certification parts of the equation, or we'll find ourselves back into the same imbalance that led to the unreadiness in 7th Fleet.
Let me just add on that. I don't want to get into too much information here in a public setting, but there's about 10 capabilities that the Department of Defense has that are never met for the COCOMs. And they're unconstrained in their request. They can say, this is what I believe I require to do my mission. And so we meet that. But naval forces, submarines, cruiser destroyers, carrier strike groups, amphib ready groups, ARGMUs are always deficient, which is a capacity. And so we do the very best to meet that. And that's the tension between the COCOM and the force provider. So that's why we have the discussions about how large a Navy do we need to have to meet this. And I think, not going to put words in Secretary Mabus's mouth, but I believe what he was trying to do at that time is to say, we need to have enough presence, which means we need to have a larger Navy.
Okay.
Which our 30-year shipbuilding plan supports.
So we need to, Commandant, you said we need to do the most we can do to meet that. Yeah, I'll go back to my very first question I asked earlier in the hearing. We're planning to decommission 6 cruisers, no investment in the ship-to-shore connector, decommission an aircraft carrier halfway through its life cycle, and decommission 11 minesweepers. Yet we're doing everything we can do to meet that, yet we're voluntarily reducing our capability and the number of ships that we have over the next several years.
That has to be balanced, Congressman, with what it costs. It might not be economically worthwhile with the risk balance to keep those cruisers going versus where those dollars can be placed for more effective deterrence in some other asset.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, gentlemen. It was a good exchange. Final word, Mr. Gallagher.
Well, let me follow up on that. I think I would like to associate myself with the thrust of Ms. Loria's line of questioning, which is to say, there simply is no way to do deterrence by denial, particularly in the Indo-PACOM theater, unless we find a way to get more Navy, Marine Corps tooth into the blunt and contact layers, right? But then the question becomes, to your point, Mr. Secretary, what's the right mix of tooth? What's the right mix of ships and sailors and Marines? And what's the overall cost? Because it doesn't need to be all carriers. Obviously, we have a lot of tools at our disposal, and I'd just like to push on that. Admiral Richardson, in your design for maintaining maritime superiority 2.0, you argue that Chinese and Russian actions may imperil the, quote, diplomatic, economic, and military bonds that link the United States to its allies and partners. And if I understood your answer to my previous question, you believe that the future frigate will play a critical role in the contact and the blunt layers in preventing this from happening and in strengthening these diplomatic, economic, and military bonds. So to get to the issue, this sort of trade-off that we have to make, I appreciate the desire to control costs. I understand that the Navy can't afford a DDG light, but Secretary Spencer, can you walk me through what went into lowering the projected cost of the second FFGX from 950 to 800? In other words, what specific costs and capabilities did you remove from the program?
Didn't remove anything, Congressman. That's a great question. That's learning curve. You build something once, you know how to build it. You build it twice, you know how to build it better. 3, 4, 5, you come down the industrial learning curve. That's what you're witnessing for the 800. No capability or capacity reduction.
And then, obviously, the frigate has an aggressive detailed design and construction award timeline. And if we sort of fall behind that timeline, it's going to result in, a loss of thousands of jobs. Do you believe you're on track to execute this contract by the end of FY20?
We are, and I want to make sure that you understand when we say aggressive, it's aggressive on a historical basis. These are all proven form designs.
Sure. And Admiral Richardson, if you would comment.
It goes to what the Secretary has talked about in terms of bringing industry in early on into the requirements process. And so that's been a tremendously informative discussion, and it enhances the confidence that we're going to be moving into the frigate with more mature technology, proven hull designs, leveraging combat systems, the latest versions, and really just now it comes down to integration of that technology. And so we have good confidence. The request for proposals went out just a little bit early, and so we're stepping through this on pace.
Yeah. And again, I would like to just get back to my colleague's line of question. I mean, I think, again, we can have a debate about the right mix of ships, but I think in any analysis, particularly as you look at the first island chain in the priority theater, I mean, it will require more ships. Now, we could have a higher degree of autonomous ships. We can do creative things with those ships, like put LRASMs on Mark 6 patrol boats and things like that, so we have to be thinking creatively. But I think we all want to execute a plan with as much urgency and alacrity as humanly possible. And if we keep sort of changing the plan and timelines get delayed, then I think that's where a lot of us get frustrated.
So I think one of the biggest changes of the last year's 30-year shipbuilding plan to this year's is that, one, we all agree a bigger Navy is what the nation needs. That's why we're building towards 355 ships. This year's plan gets to 355 20 years earlier than last year's plan. And so I think these are changes that the nation would be in favor of to reach our goal 20 years earlier.
And I'll betray my bias in a closing comment here as a Marine and as a navalist. As I read the NDS and NSS, and I've tried to read it closely, I think it's asking the Navy and the Marine Corps to do a lot more and play a unique role. I mean, if you just look at, again, the priority theater and the shift to deterrence by denial, and I don't mean that as a knock on the Army and the Air Force and everyone we work with. They have a critical role. But I think in particular, that Navy Marine Corps team is going to be critical if we're going to actually implement the National Defense Strategy. And it's remarkable to me that we actually have a bipartisan agreement on this major conceptual shift contained within those documents, but implementing it is a whole nother story, and that's going to be a task for all of us here, and it's a budget process, it's a strategy process, and so I just hope to work with all of you as we try and simply implement the National Defense Strategy, and if nothing else, that we don't slide backwards over the next 2 years after having 2 years of success in this committee. And with that, I yield my remaining 8 seconds.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. So I think we did it. Just want to again thank the witnesses for your endurance. Again, and obviously we had the delay because of the votes, but I really appreciate you hanging in there with us and being patient to answer all the questions. And with that, declare the hearing closed.